Thank you, Suzanne. But look, I'd really like to thank Gemma for coming along today. We first came across Gemma doing a webinar with the Temporary Works Forum. The Temporary Works Forum is our go-to for information on temporary works. It's an excellent location to find out all you want to know about temporary works. I very much recommend you looking them up. Gemma, if you don't mind, I robbed one of your lines from your LinkedIn today that everything is temporary works until it's permanent, and it's very true in construction. Everything we do is temporary until it's in its permanent state. And it's a question I get asked a lot: what's temporary works, or is this temporary works? And chances are, if you're asked the question, it is. So I think today we'll get a good understanding of what temporary works is and to categorize those temporary works. Now, there will be a couple of small differences in today's talk, and that Gemma will be referring to UK legislation, but the theories and the processes remain pretty much the same. So at the end, if you do have any particular questions with regards to how there might be slightly different terms in the UK and Ireland, feel free to give us a shout in the questions box at the end. So without further ado, Gemma, I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly, thanks.
Brilliant, grand. And I also agree that everything is temporary works. I've even got a t-shirt on today with that on it, but I can't get my camera working, so you won't be able to see it, unfortunately. So what is temporary works? So today we're going to go through a little bit about who I am, what temporary works is, the temporary works procedure based on BS 5975, and I'm going to walk you through a worked example. So who am I? I am Gemma Quinn. I'm a temporary works advisor at Kier. I'm a chartered civil engineer with over 15 years experience working for tier 1 contractors. Started off my career working for Morgan Sindall as a graduate engineer, worked my way up to senior engineer, sort of site agent type roles, and I've discovered this thing called temporary works, and I became a temporary works coordinator. So I got heavily involved in the Edinburgh to Glasgow Improvement Project, which is a rail project near my house where we were doing lots of temporary works on it. When all the work in Scotland dried up, I moved over to BAM Nuttall and worked as a temporary works design manager for a year. Sadly, was made redundant, and now I work as a temporary works advisor here, where I get to go around construction sites and look at what we are doing on the sites. Are they measuring up as per the care procedures? Are we, does our teams need more support? And then I've also volunteered as a director of the Temporary Works Forum, whose mission is to spread the word of what temporary works is and to help everyone carry out temporary work safely. So what is temporary works? Whenever I mention temporary works to people, they give me one of two reactions. They either love it or they hate it. So I think it's a wee bit like Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. So we'll get a wee bit technical now. Temporary works. So temporary works is an engineered solution used to support or protect either an existing structure or the permanent works during the construction or demolition. So if you look at the top right hand photo, that's showing how you're supporting a structure when we're demolishing it. The second definition is support an item of plant or equipment. So if you look at the bottom right, we're supporting this high up when it's moving something into position, and the temporary works in this case is the outrigger mats. Number 3 is support the vertical sides of an excavation during the construction and operations on site. So if you look at the bottom left, you'll see some trench support system. And then 4 is provide access. So here you will see in the middle an access staircase. And number 5 I've added in, which is how do we build it? Looking at construction sequences and logistics can also be a form of temporary works. And temporary works may be removed or left in place after the completion of the permanent works. So, like Ben said earlier, everything is temporary works when you think about it. And if we delve back in history, we'll see that we've been using temporary works since the dawn of time, ever since we became civilized. The ancient peoples were using it to move big chunks of stone about, so creating pyramids, or in this case, Stonehenge. And the temporary works in this case would be the pulley system that we use to position stones. The ancient Romans were using them to build viaducts, and then you can here see a sort of false work and a pulley system for moving blocks about. They were using it in the Roaring Twenties when they're building skyscrapers, though looking at their working platforms doesn't quite look as safe as it is to modern standards. The welfare facilities definitely look a lot different. And was there even edge protection at that time? But when you think about temporary works, a lot of people think about the big projects like this one, which is down in London. And if you look at the big prop systems, you've got rebar going on at the bottom there. And if you look at it, this is a big excavation right next to some buildings. And the whole purpose of the temporary works here is to make sure that the buildings next to it don't fall down when we're excavating. And then if you look in this example here, it's exactly the same thing. We are looking at digging next to a building. We have to do the same amount of checks to confirm that our operations isn't going to affect the buildings next to it, though it's in a lot smaller scale. So sometimes you wouldn't class this as temporary works, even though it is. Then if you look here, this was an example in Glasgow where this big steel structure here was getting lifted onto the roof of a building, which is the Citizens Theatre in the middle of Glasgow. We've got a crane, and the three items for this lift that we need to consider is what's the crane sitting on? Do we need mats or anything underneath it? How are we attaching the crane to the item we want to lift? And where are we landing it? Is it going to be stable when we move it and when we position it? So if you think about it, it's exactly the same as installing a site cabin in the middle of Edinburgh. So you've got your crane, which in this case is a HIAB. We have to check what's it sitting on. In this case, it's outrigger mats, which you can see at the bottom here. How are we attaching it to the cabin? We've got some chains and we've got lifting eye points. And then where are we positioning it? We've got big concrete blocks because it's on a slope, which you can't really see in the photo. And we have to check that whole operation. Now, if you consider risk profile, the picture before, I would say that is very obvious, a very high risk item, especially if you just make out that there's a railway right next to it. Here, it's also quite risky because it's in an environment where there's a lot of public about. So right next to where they're working is people going to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, for example. So there's a different kind of risk we need to consider, which is members of the public. So why should we be concerned about temporary works? Like, really, who cares? Well, when things go wrong, people can get hurt. And the consequence of that failure can be quite severe. It could be a loss of life. Here's two examples in Liverpool where people were seriously injured and one worker died when scaffolding collapsed. And then, so to control all of that, you've got the temporary works procedures and British standards. So back in the 1960s, 70s, there was a lot of incidents where they recognised there was formwork and falsework collapse, scaffolding collapse. So the government put together the Bragg report, which looked into what was causing all of this. And we published it in the 70s and realised that, okay, we need to have one conscious mind on site controlling temporary works. They created the concept of temporary works, which is what we mentioned earlier, and the need for something or a mechanism to control it. They produced the Code of Practice for Temporary Works and Procedures and the Principal Stress Design of False Work. It started off as a false work guide, and now it's evolved over the years into temporary works procedure, which all companies that I've worked for have based their temporary works procedure on. And the loose flow of this is that you identify what temporary works you've got on site, and for each temporary works item, you create a design for it, you check that design, you control it on site using a permit to load and permit to unload system, and at the heart of it is someone called a Temperance Coordinator. So in each business, you have someone called a designated individual. and they are appointed to manage temporary works for your organisation. They're usually like a board director or someone high up who can affect policy and procedure in your company. They appoint people to each project called Temporary Works Coordinators. And as you can see, this is the CARES procedures, and there's a lot of boxes that they have to tick, but it can be kind of simplified into the Temporary Works Coordinator's role is to ensure the right person has the right information at the right time to make the right decision on site. They have people called Temporary Works Supervisors, which are there to help support the Temporary Works Coordinator. They might be specialists in whatever temporary works item you're doing, so formwork specialist, scaffolding specialist, for example, and they can look at what you're building and make sure it's built correctly as it's being constructed. And then in here we have Temporary Works Advisors, which is my role, and we go around carrying out audits to benchmark against our procedures. We develop and deliver training packs to our teams. We offer assistance and guidance and point people in the right direction on where to find things. And we also deliver CITB accredited Temporary Works Coordinator courses to deliver that training. So some things to consider depending on what organisation you work for. So if you're a client, you need to identify temporary works in your bid stages and encourage your designers to eliminate the need for temporary works where you can. If you're a designer, a permanent works designer, identify and consider how on earth is my team going to build this, and try and eliminate the need for temporary works and the permanent works design. And if you are a main contractor, a principal contractor, or a subcontractor, you need to look at temporary works at the bidding stage. Now, Ben mentioned just before we came on this call how in one of the tenders no one had actually looked at temporary works as part of it, and they hadn't budgeted for that, and that can lead to extra costs for the companies involved. That can also lead to mistakes happening, or you carrying out the construction sequence in a way that is not as efficient as it could have been if you had considered temporary works earlier in the process. And then if you're a supply chain or a specialist within the industry, your role is to make sure the solutions that you come up with fit in with what the contractors and the designers are doing, and to offer technical advice on how to carry out the temporary works that you're providing safely. So we're going to look at CARES temporary works procedure now, because that's the one I'm most familiar with. And so this is the front page of our procedure, and it goes through a sort of like how to step-by-step process of what to do. Again, it's simplified on the right-hand side here. You start off with identifying what temporary works you need, appointing the temporary works coordinator. They assess the risk, record that risk, and then carry out designs and design checks and all the permits to work systems depending on what risk they deem the temporary works to be. So a simplified version is that we identify the temporary works on a register. The temporary works coordinator pulls all the information together onto a design brief. They send that to the designer. The designer designs the item, they get it checked, they bring it back to the temporary works coordinator, they go, yep, that's the design and he did this, we're happy that's going to work, or it's not, and they ask more questions. It then goes to the construction teams. When they're happy with it, they start building it, and they issue a permit to load to say that it's built as per the design, and they use the permit to load process as like hold points of where we need to identify what's needed, or a check that needs to be carried out before you go into the next step of your temporary works sequence. So if we look at the first part, which is appointing a temporary works coordinator and identifying what temporary works you need. This is the CARE temporary works appointment form. So the designated individual, who is the high honcho person in your organisation that looks after temporary works, would appoint someone. What they have to do is they have to assess the competency of the person who want to be a Temporary Works Coordinator. So the first page is telling the Temporary Works Coordinator what the responsibilities are. And the second and third page is about assessing the competency of that Temporary Works Coordinator, that they have met the requirements needed for the task they will be looking after. So best thing is that the Temporary Works Coordinator has the relevant experience and knowledge to carry out that temporary work. So if all they've been doing is putting up hoardings and they don't know anything about scaffolding, maybe they're not the right Temporary Works Coordinator to deal with a project full of scaffolding. Their experience needs to be technical and practical. So it'd be great if they were a chartered civil engineer, for example. In gear system, if we've got a high risk project where it's 6 or more high risk activities, we would prefer a person to be a chartered civil engineer with the experience and knowledge to carry out that work. If it's a building, for example, generally you don't get civil engineers working in buildings. It's usually a construction engineer or a construction management degree person who is a site manager or a project manager. So they're really expecting them to have extensive site experience and the suitable site experience of carrying out that works before. And the bare minimum requirement is that they've done a Temporary Works Coordinator course. So they understand the control process involved, they understand their duties, and it's not just a case of, okay, we'll put them on a course for 2 days, that's it, they're a Temporary Works Coordinator. They need to be mentored and looked after, because it's quite it's a lot of responsibility to become a Temporary Works Coordinator. Not only are you responsible for programme and technical information, you're potentially responsible for the risk of site and people's the risk of health, the risk of damage to property, to people, and anything else involved with it. You are the controller of all the information, and if anything goes wrong, the first thing that the Health and Safety Executive or equivalent will look at is what did the Temporary Works Coordinator do to control this. So as mentioned earlier, Temporary Works Register is the document that we use to write down all the temporary works on site, to evaluate the risk profile, if it's high, medium, low, and then use this document to track where we are along the construction process or the design process. You've got your design briefs, your drawings, your design check certificates, etc. So looking at the next bit, which is this assessment of risk. So since I'm speaking to the risk people, this is the bit that you're probably most going to benefit from or kind of know more about. So just like when you do a risk assessment method statement, you're assessing the risk profile of what you do. In Temporary Works, it's just the same. You start off, is it a non-significant Temporary Works item, or is it a significant Temporary Works item? And if it's a significant Temporary Works item, it needs to be put on the register as a low, medium, or high risk. So, significant item of Temporary Works are those identified in Figure 1, which is some tables I'm going to show you. These list out the items, they're non-exhaustive, and items of Temporary Works not identified may also be considered as part of that. For non-significant items of Temporary Works, these are the ones that fall below the low risk category level. They have little or no design input. These items do not need to be included in the Temporary Works Control Register, as these items may be subject to the same standards of safe working practices and other operations. So, non-significant items may include aluminium and mobile access towers used to erect to manufacturer's recommendations. So the manufacturer has designed this, and we don't need to check that design or anything as part of the process. We just need to know how to implement it correctly. Ground level slab edge shutters that are 300 mil deep, and shallow excavations that are less than 600 mil deep. Each organisation is going to have different categories of low, medium, and high risk, depending on the experience of the people working for them and the sort of operational experience that the organisation has done. So you've got low, medium and high risk. The context also plays a great bearing on the risk category. So what's low in one context might be high risk in another. Excuse me. Risks here cover both health and safety risk and risk to the project. So it could be a financial risk, it could be risk to the public. So what's low in one context and medium or high risk in another? So if you're digging a hole in the left-hand picture, so in the middle of the field, no one around it, the consequence of failure is that the trench could collapse and not hurt anyone because there's no one inside it. Whereas if you are digging in that high street there on the right-hand photo, you've got members of the public going past. If it's on the main road, you might have additional vehicle loadings onto the side of the excavation, so there's more likely that you might need more heavy trench support, for example. You'll need more barriers around it to stop enterprising members of the public to come in, or nosy parkers come in and look at things that could cause damage to themselves or others. And then there's other risks that covers the health and safety risks as well as the rest of the project. So if you take that context again, that you're digging the hole but it's in the middle of that railway, first of all you need to get permission from the railway that you can go dig the hole. You need to stop all the trains from running, and there's so many other things you need to do in that context which make it difficult. So again, that would be a higher risk event. So here is a sort of table to give you an idea of what low, medium and high risks are in terms of what CURE do. So site establishment, if you've got site cabins up to 2 stories, we class that as low because the wind loading factor is quite low for single or double story. Once you get into stacking up the cabins, that's where it gets higher. For formwork and false work, formwork for columns using clamps up to 4 meters or single-sided formwork is instantly a medium. For excavation, so excavation support up to 3 meters in uniform good ground conditions where no dewatering is required is classed as low. But once your ground conditions change, a fair ground or non-cohesive ground, so that's when it's made up of, say, boulders but a little bit of sand, it's all a bunch of stuff mixed together and it doesn't hold its shape, that's when it's considered a bit more medium or high risk endeavours. So looking at the process, you would identify the temporary works item. In our case, we'd look at table 1 and say, okay, is it low, medium or high risk? And always remember that it's at the discretion of the Temporary Works Coordinator. So one person might deem it to be a low risk item, but because of the lack of familiarity with the project or with the activity, a Temporary Works Coordinator may choose to make it a higher risk than someone else who has been doing it for many years. So context of not only where it is, but who is dealing with it is also a factor. And then we've got different control measures if it's a low, medium or high risk. It's to do with what paperwork is required, which I'll go into in a minute. So for the control measure register, you want to keep the temporary works and the temporary works coordinator's radar. The other saying is if the temporary works coordinator doesn't know about it, it shouldn't be happening. Design brief is there to make sure that the temporary works coordinator tells the designer what they want. The design information, you need to have enough of it so that the designer who's never been to the site before understands it. Design checks, that's to make sure that it's been designed correctly. Safe systems will work, that's your risk assessment method statements. You've got inspections, and then you've got permits systems as well. And communication is a big key. So the temporary works coordinator is controlling this whole process. And it's good to think of them as like a spider web. So they should be in contact with everyone here, subcontractors, clients, designers. They're really the heart of the project and should know what's going on at the project at any one time and if anything else is required. And they should be the go-between between all these different people and departments. So the next bit we're going to look at is preparing a design brief. The design brief is what tells the designer what you want to design. So if you think about it, you've got your construction site in Glasgow, for example, but your designer is based in London. Has never been to Glasgow before and doesn't know anything about your project. So all the information they're going to get is on this piece of paper here. You've got the project details, which is your standard, where is it, what do you want me to do? The scope and description is, okay, I need you to do X, Y, Z. The first solution is, well, I've got some of this material on site and it'd be really handy if you could incorporate that into the design without me having to buy any more. Special considerations. So that's, oh, by the way, we're digging a hole, but it's right next to a railway and there's a chance we could undermine the track. Yeah, the designer needs to know all this, or as part of the design checks submission, you have to submit it to Network Rail so they can approve it. Reference documents, so that's any drawing sketches, any scaffold designs, anything that you are putting in, you need to tell them in here. So you treat this as sort of like a cover sheet as well. It tells all the information you're attaching it when you're sending it to them on an email, and what deliverables are required. So what do we need from you? We need a drawing. It needs to be on next Tuesday. We need a residual risk statement, which is a risk assessment. We need some calculations because we're going to show these to Network Rail to say that we're happy with it. And then we need a design check certificate that you can sign to say that you've designed it correctly and that someone's checked it. So all that information goes to the designers. Now, it could be your own in-house Tempe Works designers. So in Cure, they're called Cure Professional Services. We're based mostly in England and close to Wales. There could be a Tempe Works supplier. So the people you can see here. There could be a subcontractor's Tempe Works designer in-house, or it could be a specialist Tempe Works designer. Some are based here as well. Or it could be a specialist, or it could be a Tempe Works designer who's separate to the activity and is doing like a third-party check, for example. So the Tempe Works design happens. Things to consider is that the design is based on what is included in the design brief. So if you don't put it in the design brief, the designer isn't going to know you want it. There needs to be adequate information. So there's no point just having a one-liner saying, can you design me a scaffold? If you don't tell me where the scaffold's going, how big it needs to be, what you're putting on the scaffold, or any hazards that are in the way, I can't design you a scaffold. Think about loadings, what effects on structures it could have, anything it's going to interfere with. For example, my scaffold is going to be tied onto a building, but it's a school, so we need to provide access into the school. So we're going to be installing it at night, so we're going to use big lamps and it might be difficult to see. Strengths of components, it could be special design considerations they need to take care of, or client considerations. Now, have you all heard of ERIC, which is eliminate, reduce, inform, or isolate and control, which is a hierarchy of control measures. So if you can eliminate the risk, that's great, don't do the thing. You reduce it by providing something that's going to reduce the risk to the person. Inform is, okay, this is the bit we can't design out. This is still going to be an issue, you're going to have to do something about it. And control is, we're going to put a barrier around it so no one gets near it. And the best Tempe Works schemes are those that eliminate the need for Tempe Works. For example, if you're installing a building and you need to prop one of the floor levels, or you had the option of modifying that floor that you didn't need to prop it, it's probably better that you don't install the props, you don't design it that needs props. This is the design output, so usually you get a sketch, you might get the calculations, and you will get a design check certificate to say that this is what we've designed it to, this is the codes we've used, this is any considerations that you might have. So the flow of risk is the Tempe Works coordinator at the start has identified the need for temporary works and the risks associated with it. They have told the designer about the temporary works item and the risks associated with it and the design brief. The designer has tried to remove as much risk as they can. They then go back to the temporary works coordinator and say, this is what we've done, but there's still risk A, B, C because we can't design it out. Then it gets reviewed, and it is usually reviewed by another designer. What they're looking for is adequacy of the design. Is it compliant with the design brief? And is it going to work? Is the concept going to work? What British standards have they used to all the numbers add up? So the Temperance Works design and check certificate looks a bit like this. This is what we receive back. And the design check is an evaluation of the design to determine whether it conforms with the design brief and can be expected to provide a safe engineered solution. So like earlier, we mentioned that temporary works can be high, medium or low risk. Design check categories are to do with how complex it is to design something. So for things that are not that complex to design, it might be a Cat 0, which is a standard solution checked by another member of the site team to design. So like earlier we mentioned using a hacky staircase system or an aluminium tower staircase system, where it's a pre-engineered solution, so someone else has designed it and you're using an off-the-shelf product. But you want to make sure that it works in the situation that you're using it in. So the person sitting next to you would check that you've basically picked the right one out of the catalogue. Cat 1 check is for a simple design where you need to put some numbers to it. It might be a hoarding design, for example, and you've done a wind check calculation on it. So the person's, this would go to a designer, and then the designer sitting next to them would check it. A Cat 2 is for a more complex design where you might need to put some more numbers to it, or it's a bit more tricky. So when they'll send it to someone else who's never seen that design before, usually in another office or another team, and they will start looking at it from scratch. They'll do their own calculations and then they'll look at the calculations that the first person reduced and do they match. Then Cat 3 is when it's a more complex or innovative design. Maybe you've never designed something like that before, and it's checked by a separate organisation, and instead of getting the calculations through, you just get the drawing to say that this is what we're going to do, and it's up to that Cat 3 checker to come up with their own calculations to see if they reach the same conclusion. And this is the extract from the BS 5975 that shows that. Standard solutions is another thing to think about. So that's your Cat 0s. They are called standard solutions, so what exactly is this? A temporary work standard solution is an off-the-shelf, tried and tested design supported by existing calculations or published safe loading information. Usually they're aluminium towers or staircases, fence panels, silo-based foundations, or trench boxes. The thing to be cautious about here is that the person who is picking the solution becomes the designer. So they can, under CDM or equivalent, they are responsible that the solution is going to work. So you might be picking an MGF or a ground force trench box to use, but MGF and ground force will have a clause on their catalogue saying it is the person who picks and chooses to use it who becomes the designer to check that it can be used in the situation that they propose. Same with props and same with outrigger feet. So the next bit we're going to look at is preparing the safe system will work and having the temporary work supervisors check it. So safe system work is basically your risk assessment method statement. That's making sure that your design and any of the risks that you got from your designer is controlled as part of your risk assessment and method statement. And the person that looks after that on site is called the temporary work supervisor. It's their job to support the temporary works coordinator, be their eyes and ears, and look at the item that's being built and checking it matches the drawing, matches the safe system of work, and is being installed correctly. Similar to Temperance Coordinators, they have to be appointed. They have to have the right competency, so they have to have been on the Temporary Work Supervisor training course. They have to have the right experience in what they're doing, but not necessarily have to be a chartered civil engineer. It could be a scaffolder if they're looking after scaffolding, for example. And sometimes the temporary work supervisors are not within your organisation. They could be the foreman from the scaffold company that's installed the scaffold for you, for example. But the one thing is they need to have been on the training course. So for each item of temporary works, you write down who's the supervisor in charge of it. And again, every time you get a new piece of information, you're updating temporary works register so you keep track of this. Some of the more complex sites I've worked on have had 50, 100 temporary works items, so it can take a bit, and sometimes be a full-time job just to manage temporary works on a project. Inspection and checklists. This is where, as part of the process, you're checking things on your site. It could be the equipment, it could be checking for damage or defects, critical components, all that kind of stuff. And if there is any changes before you start building something, for example, the wrong crane showed up. So instead of being a 100-ton crane, they've given you a 200-ton crane, and your outrigger loadings are different, you need to change it. You need to go back to the designer and say, look, this is a change happened. So why do we have to manage that change? Well, it could become costly. If something went wrong and you're the person that's implemented that change and not gone as per the design, you take on the designer's responsibilities, and it could be you that goes up against prosecution if something goes wrong. Also, people could get hurt. So temporary works briefing, the management of change. Temporary works change and its management can be temporary works' biggest challenge. Things move so quickly that change is sometimes hard to manage. In a nutshell, a temporary works coordinator should refer to all significant changes back to the temporary works designer, not be afraid to stop the work whilst the issues are sorted out, and instruct the direction team to change the temporary works to match drawings unless there's some very good reason not to. And if there's a very good reason, stop what you're doing, discuss it, record what changes are being made, check it with the designer, and confirm it's okay to proceed, because that small change could actually be a structural weakness and could cause failure later on in the process. So the next bit is about carrying out and what records you need to keep, and how we control things is on with permits. So your permits to load and unload, this is basically hold points. So if you're installing a scaffold, you do one for the foundations, that they've been installed correctly and that you're going to load them. Then you do one for the anchors, and you do one for the actual scaffold itself. And then you do a permit to strike or unload to say that at each level that we can proceed on to the next one. Think of it similar to a hot works permit or a permit to enter a confined space. The reason it's there is to notify someone of a hazard or a condition that needs to be met in order to proceed to the next step. And they can use visual aids on site with, like, this is a scaffold erection and inspection record, kind of shows what's been going on. And temporary works in use, so periodic inspections may be required to hoardings, tower crane bases, cofferdams, access gantries, pylon mats, scaffolding, and any other relatively long-term temporary works item. So the next bit is, once you've used your temporary works, how do you dismantle it in a safe manner? So don't forget to ignore the key stage in the life of a piece of temporary works is when you're removing it. Have to make sure that there's no chance of collapse, and agree on your dismantling sequence. That's maybe something you need to consider when you're installing it. So you've installed a scaffold and then you built something around the scaffold, and you now find it difficult to remove that scaffold. dismantling sequence is not always the reverse of direction. And records, it's important to keep all records so that you can learn from them. And then if you have any audits, you can cover them. So a worked example. These next pages are based on work I did for BAM. So you will see a lot of BAM being mentioned. So this is the Carmen Road Bridge project. And here's a copy of the Tempe Works register, which you'll notice is slightly different to Kier's version. So I identified what Tempe Works was needed. So to give you a wee bit of context, Carmen Road Bridge is the only vehicle access over a railway to this road, Carmen Road, where 6 properties were in an island between the A82 motorway and a railway. So if we removed this bridge, they would not have access to the properties. They'd either be stuck in the properties or be stuck outside. What we found was that during Network Rail's inspections, they discovered that the bridge was starting to deteriorate in strength, so they put in some temporary props, which is support or protect either an existing structure or the permanent works during the construction or demolition sequence. This was done for safety reasons, and they instructed BAM to come up with a solution on how to install this bridge. And we were only given 2 weekend possessions, so 2 54-hour periods to be able to do this work when the railway was shut. So as part of the Tempe Works checks for this, I had to support and protect either an existing structure or the permanent works during the construction demolition. So I had to look at the sequence of how do we demolish the existing bridge deck and then replace it. So this shows the sequencing that we looked at what point we could take out the props that were supporting the bridge deck, and at what point and how we were going to protect the railway underneath it. Another thing I had to look at is because we're using excavators right next to the edge of the abutment face, would that cause overloading? So that was another temporary works item, support and protect the structure. Another thing I had to consider was once we have demolished the bridge, how do we install the new bit, the new bridge sections? So I had to look at using a crane. I identified that the only place to put the crane was there, but unfortunately there wasn't enough space to install it. So we had to go by railway. Instead, we used a key-up crane, which is a rail-mounted crane here, to lift the new bridge pieces here. We had to find a new lay-down area to bring the pieces along on the railway. So this is where the how do we build it and the construction sequence and logistics temporary works checks were carried out. So for the key-off, which is the rail-mounted crane, I had to consider where is this crane going to be sitting when it's lifting. And if you look at the right-hand photo, you've got the railway there. You've got a soft berge and some cables there. And it would have outrigger mats to help spread the load. So would these clash with that? So I had to do some sketches. And this is some information that I sent to designers to check what clashes were in the way as part of my design brief. The other thing I had to consider from a technical point of view is something called the track support zone. This is where you've got your track, you come out 1 metre and down a 45-degree angle, and all the bits in red and yellow there supports the track. So that's all the ground underneath it. If we either dig into this area or put in a load on top of it, like an outrigger, that could disturb that and interfere with it, causing the track to warp. So we had to consider where are we putting the outrigger mats. Also, the other thing to consider is you've got the ballast, which is all this heavily engineered 100 kilonewtons per metre squared load, and then you've got this grass area here. Was there a potential that half the mat would overturn or sink into the ground? So that was another thing I had to consider. So that again is all raising the risk profile. Here's some sketches trying to show where we could put the mats. And this is the design brief that I sent. Note that it talks about what timescales things were needed, some safety concerns, And I also attached these mats, and this is what we came up with. So it looked very similar to what I proposed, but the designer came back with some considerations. For example, some testing that we had to do to check that the ground can take the mat loading. And here's a photo now of them carrying out the work. So that's the key-off crane there, lifting in the components. And I don't think you can make out the outriggers because they're on the other side of the bridge. But this is the bridge, what the bridge looked like. So I controlled all that activity by issuing a permit to load for the ground to confirm that when we set up the mats, they were in the right position, they weren't going to clash with anything as per the design. And then this is what the bridge looked like when we finished. So the next bit now is where can you get help after this? So I'm going to introduce you to the Tempe Works forum. Notice the logo at the top right hand side. Contact information is at the bottom. So founded in 2009 by a group of engineers and construction professionals coming together across the industry, realising Tempe Works could be a bit of an issue. We want to come up with a solution. So created the Tempe Works Forum as a specialist knowledge society of the Institution of Civil Engineers to look into Tempe Works, promote what it is, and it's now a non-for-profit company. Our aims is being the focal point of Tempe Works knowledge, create debate, raise competence, and promote research in Tempe Works. We carry out 4 meetings a year, streamed online. We have resources for libraries with lots of technical information sheets. I have just helped produce one on outrigger mats, funnily enough. And we also have access to online web chat where people can talk about Tempe Works and ask each other advice and questions. We're always looking for new members, so check out the membership at the bottom. And here's my contact information if you ever want to have a chat about Tempe Works. Always willing to make new friends. And thank you for your time. I now invite your questions.
Gemma, thanks very much for that. It's a huge subject, but you've managed to really frame a lot of it in an hour, and well done for that. We have had a couple of questions. Some of them you may have answered as the presentation went on, but I'll throw them out there. John asked that BS 5975 includes Table 1, which has very low risk class and states that they may not need to be added to the Tempe Works register or need a design brief and can be just managed by RAMs and inspection. Have you examples of these scenarios, as can sometimes get confusing what is not added to the register?
Right, so if we go back to the page with, so this is a bit you were talking about, restricted categories, not design check, sorry. So non-significant items are those that fall below the low risk. So they have no design input. We did have a picture of these ones. So depending on who you speak to and depending on, I would class anything from a ladder to small barriers, maybe like we call them Chapter 8 barriers. They're like crowd barriers. They're not quite fence banners. Things like that, which you wouldn't need to design, you would just simply install. Or a hop-up, not hop-up, what they called, a small mute that doesn't need outrigger support that you're using on a base slab or where you're confident the ground can take its weight.
Yeah, that's it. Sometimes it is a little bit grey. It's hard because the same cherry picker depends on the scenario, depends on where it is, what it's doing.
It's contextual.
Context, good word, yeah. So,
Very contextual.
and it's all well and good till something goes wrong. But yeah, we don't have to design everything to an inch of its life. If there is a good manual, I find if there's a good manual, good supplier and manufacturer's information has been used as per that, I think a lot of that will tick a lot of boxes for me. It's only when you start getting more high risk or you're starting to go off that initial design that I'd start worrying about it. Another question from Paul. Paul, thanks you for the presentation. He asked what stakeholders are required to sign the CARE temporary works design and check certificate. I think you covered that too, in fairness.
So it would be whoever designed it and then whoever did the check. So if it's CAP 0 or CAP 1, it would be the person who designed it and then the person who checked it would be sitting next to them. If it's CAP 2, it would be the person who designed it in one office and then the person who checked in the other office. If it's a CAP 3, you could have lots of people involved. You could be the person that designed it, then the person who checked it within their organisation would sign it. Then it would be the third party check, which would be the other organisation who check it and sign it to say that they've done a design and checked it. So you could have multiple people
depending on
signing
the risk factor.
Pardon?
Depending on the risk factor or the category of the design.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're always looking for 2 people to do a check, to do any temporary works as a minimum. It's the person who, if it's a CAT 0 and you're picking a proprietary system, it's the person who's picked it and then someone has checked to pick the right thing, all the way up to it's an organisation has designed something and checked it, and then you've got an independent organisation reviewing it as well. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. It does for me. That's it. That's all the questions we have. The presentation was that good. Everyone understands temporary works from top to bottom now.
Or did fall asleep?
No, I said it's a huge subject. It's put a lot of context in for me and where everything stands. But obviously, if you're involved in these things day to day, you need more. I cannot recommend highly enough to everyone that's on the COD Temporary Works Forum. As I said, it is our go-to for information when we're scratching our head. It's well worth being part of the Temporary Works Forum. The webinars, as I said, is where we came across Gemma for the first time, and I really appreciate your time and coming and giving this talk for us today.
Thank you so much.
We'll let you go. Might even get a little bit of lunch in before you have to get back to it. And again, thanks very, very much.
Thank you.